People have been arguing over whether the new edition of D&D is 6th edition or 5.5 edition, or what Wizards of the Coast call it, the 2024 core rulebooks for the 5th edition of the game, but it's obvious what it is. It is the 9th edition of D&D. Wizards of the Coast, along with the players of D&D, have been using the software approach where a new version number, whole number version, means a major overhaul, if not a complete overhaul, of the game. The origin of this convention began in 2003 when Wizards of the Coast called 3.5 version 3.5. They were hedging their bets. They were saying this is a big improvement to 3rd edition, but you can still use your 3rd edition products, 3.0 edition products, with the new version of the game because look, they have the same number at the beginning, 3. Since then, having a different whole number has been reserved for complete overhauls of the system, so that happened with 4th edition D&D and also with 5th edition. To that, I have to say I dislike the software version approach to reserving whole number editions for overhauls. If you look at most tabletop role-playing games, they just give a new number to a new edition. Call of Cthulhu now I think is in its 7th edition. As we can see, the naming of these editions for Wizards of the Coast has been informed by commercial considerations. This year's version of their game is being called the 2024 core rulebooks of the 5th edition, and the reason for that is obvious. They don't want sales for the entire past 10 years of products to tank while people are waiting for the new rules. And it means that we as players parrot Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro's marketing speak when we use their edition numbers. As we look at the history of editions in D&D, this numbering convention is actually pretty inconsistent and informed by said market considerations. And it also has an effect on the design process. The design team that's designing the new edition has to be told by corporate whether this is going to be compatible with the previous edition or break from the previous edition. Short-term commercial considerations trump the designer's tendencies and distort the natural evolution and affect the long-term health of the game. Before I explain why I think the new edition is 9th edition, based on a more consistent and rational definition of an edition, I will first introduce myself. I'm Ronald, the Rules Lawyer. I am a lawyer who runs tabletop role-playing games. I've been doing so over the last 14 years now. My preferred system is Pathfinder 2e, but I've also run D&D 5th edition. And if you haven't yet, support my Patreon. I don't make money as an attorney. For more information on why that is, look at the video whose thumbnail is on the screen. Supporting my Patreon gives you ad-free early access to many of my videos and exclusive content. So let's define what a new edition of a tabletop role-playing game is. I say it should be a republication of the core rules with revisions with the intent of replacing the previous core rules. Pretty straightforward. So it's when they republish their core system, not supplements, and they are trying to tell us buy our new version of these rules to replace the older ones. Note that this does not require a complete overhaul of the game. We don't need to have complete overhauls to improve our games. The dictionary definition of an edition simply says another version of something that you are publishing. So armed with this definition, let's go through the history of D&D. Well, D&D was first published in 1974. It's now lovingly called Original Dungeons & Dragons, but under our definition, it is the 1st edition. And it was published in this wood grain box, and it was soon followed with a series of supplements, and I'm going to address Greyhawk, the first supplement, which filled in a lot of rules that came to be familiar to players of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons later. Some people call Greyhawk edition 0.5, but by our definition of a new edition, they would need to be republishing their core rules. And what I would say here is that they were expanding the core rules to the game by adding another class and more rules for ability scores and more spells and monsters. We also get different hit dice for different classes and different weapon damage dice. But that's completing the core rules. We get to the 2nd edition when we get to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the next version of Dungeons & Dragons that they publish. The AD&D Monster Manual came out in 1977, which worked with the original rules, so I don't really see that as the starting point for this edition. It's really when the Player's Handbook comes out in 1978. It incorporates many of the additions to the original 1974 D&D box set and articles from the Dragon magazine, including more classes, more codified rules for combat, and other things. However, we need to include the Dungeons & Dragons box set that came out a year before in 1977, also known by fans of the hobby as the Holmes Basic set. It's a weird set, and it's kind of transitional between different versions of the game. It has some things that come up in the later basic Dungeons & Dragons line, such as race as class. There are other things like armor class starting at 9, and there being only one alignment axis of chaotic versus lawful. But it also explicitly presents itself as a starter set. You only get the first 3 levels of experience, and to continue your game, you are supposed to get advanced Dungeons & Dragons. So given what it was at the time it was published in 1977, it's more accurate and honest to say that it was a starter set for AD&D. It's with a 1981 basic set, also called the Moldvay set, which has rules that go up to level 14, that it becomes official that there's a second parallel D&D rule set. And we have to address this now. Which D&D path do we follow? Advanced Dungeons & Dragons or Basic? AD&D came out with what were officially called first and second edition before Wizards of the Coast published what we call third edition D&D. In the meantime, there were a number of products that republished the rules of basic Dungeons & Dragons. Now, which line do we follow to follow our edition numbers? So I think we follow the AD&D track, most obviously because we now know the 2000 edition to be third edition, which follows sequentially after second edition. But for other reasons, AD&D was the more well-known and commercially successful line. It was more in the public consciousness. The officially licensed computer role-playing games, the Gold Box games in the early 90s and Baldur's Gate later in the 90s, were based on first and second editions of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, respectively. This is my belief. If someone disagrees with me, let me know. I did live through the time, and I do think that on the store shelves, AD&D was just more prominent than the basic D&D products. I also think that what many call third edition is the successor to AD&D rules-wise. A big pitch for these rules was character customization. You can choose race and class separately. You have many more classes akin to what you had in AD&D. You can multi-class. There's a premium put on having mechanically unique characters. Now, it's much more characteristic of advanced D&D than basic D&D. You also had the 2 alignment axes. Not only were you lawful or chaotic, you were lawful good or chaotic good. The way you determined ability scores, also the fact that you were not dead at 0 hit points, were all based in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, not basic. And also, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons kept evolving. Second edition had the player's options books like Skills and Powers that allowed you to customize your characters more, where we saw the precursors to skills and also customizing your character within your class, things that become core to what we can now call third edition. Meanwhile, basic D&D stayed static and was basically releasing more starter sets for the same rules. So now that we have determined we are following the AD&D line, we now call third edition what is officially called second edition. In 1989, they released the, quote, second edition, unquote, version of the rules. Notably, this is the first time the publishers use an edition number to refer to a new edition of the game. They wanted to sell new books. Thus, it meets our definition of a new edition. And unlike what some people say, this was not simply a cleaning up and reorganization of the same rules. There were some substantive changes, including raising the racial level limits, grouping of classes, having specialist magic users, bards becoming a core class, removing the monk, removing demons, devils, and assassins. The list goes on. Some people watching may think that 4th edition will be the player's option books that come out as part of what was called 2nd edition. These were changes to the game. However, they were optional supplements to the 2nd edition rules. They presented all of the changes in them a la carte. You can take them, borrow them as you wish in your base game. Again, it was more of a testing ground for what came later. And that was, in the year 2000, they republished the game as Dungeons & Dragons. They dropped the edition number in their official text. They also have dropped the divide between basic D&D and advanced D&D. It's now all just Dungeons & Dragons.
We are no longer in the position where we think of D&D as an addition. It's just D&D.
And here we have the first huge overhaul of Dungeons & Dragons rules-wise, and it's a very fascinating revolution in the game that I did 2 videos on. I'll have links in the video description if you want to learn more about that. So there's no question they revised the game and wanted you to buy the new books in 2000. The same thing happens in 2003 when they released quote-unquote version 3.5. And here they made a lot of changes to the core rules, things that were fixing issues that were unanticipated in the way they overhauled the game. This is also the first time they used the software convention of having a partial edition change. They said at the time that you could use all of your 3rd edition books up to that point with the new version of the rules. Well, it turned out many people did not use a lot of the 3.0 books with 3.5. Some of them were used, but there was a substantial number of rules changes that made a good deal of the 3.0 material not very usable. So we have an instance here of them hedging their bets with their version numbers. It's new enough. In fact, it's half of an edition change that you want to buy the new books, but you can still buy our other books that predate this new edition. Keep buying our books. Next, we have the most divisive edition in D&D history, what I'm calling 6th edition D&D. Interesting to me, they called this 4th edition when they published it. If you open to the credits, they call the design team the 4th edition design team. This was even more of an overhaul than the 2000 edition was, and detractors of this edition said it was too different from what D&D had been before. At the same time, it did some things well, and a lot of the lessons learned from it attempting what it did were incorporated into Pathfinder 2nd edition, which I enjoy today. 7th edition will come as a surprise to some. I think that D&D Essentials, which started getting published in 2010, was the next edition of the game, was 7th edition, because they basically publish a set of books that on their own were a complete set of books, another presentation of the rules for consumers. They also presented new versions of many of the basic classes, like here, the clerics, fighters, rogues, and wizards in the book Heroes of the Fallen Lands, where they walked back some from the design they had created in 2008, where every class had 1 daily ability, 1 encounter ability, and 2 at-will abilities at level 1. For a great explanation of what Essentials was, I'm going to include a link to a Reddit thread I found where commenters really explained it, called What the Heck is 4E Essentials? It was some going back to earlier versions of D&D where marshals relied more on at-will abilities and casters more on daily abilities that changed day to day. But yes, it fits our definition of a new edition. Wizards of the Coast was calling them a new starting point for new players, while not saying it was a new edition. But again, we're not using their marketing speak, we're using our own definition. Next, we have the most popular and most commercially successful version of D&D to date, 8th edition, which came out in 2014. Here, at least in the original books, they avoid saying that it's a new edition or that it is 5th edition. They just say it's D&D.
It's just D&D.
However, it fits our definition, obviously, because it's the new version of the rules that they want us to buy to replace our quote-unquote 4th edition books. So it should now be clear why the new edition coming out this year is 9th edition. It's definitely easier to say that than the 2024 core rulebooks for 5th edition. We're not going to get hung up over whether the new version of these rules, which are still being revised, are compatible with previous materials. Again, that's irrelevant to our definition. To underscore this point, it looks like there are more changes between this and the previous edition than there were between 1st and 2nd edition Advanced D&D, which warranted its own whole number. And for purposes of our definition, despite them claiming it's not a new edition, they make it very clear, and they've been very consistent with saying that these are to replace the 2014 versions of the Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, and Dungeon Master's Guide. And let's face it, people who are still playing D&D will very likely, I would say the vast majority, will be buying the new version of the rules. So a few final thoughts. This unwillingness by Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro to say that this is a new edition of the game, I think stifles the development of the game. There's been a lot of complaints online about the designers prioritizing compatibility with what came before. Ronald from the future, I want to insert here that when they announced that they were making a new edition of D&D, that they said that they had reached the perfect state, rules-wise, in the system, that no revisions would ever be made again in the future, which is absurd. Why would you say that, Megan? Why would you say that and say you're never going to innovate again? And also, it just wasn't honest.
We did a smart thing with 5th edition by listening to the fans. And what came out of that process was a system that is stable, that is well-loved, that incorporates the best elements of earlier editions. Now that we have that, it's just D&D.
However, I do think that there is something right that they're doing here in naming the new edition after the year. It's something that over time, if they abandon edition numbers, could have an effect in freeing up the design space to have a more natural evolution in the design of the game between editions. Sure, they're also doing it to avoid gutting sales of the current edition of the game, and they're possibly setting up a continuously evolving rule set with a game-as-service model where you have to subscribe to D&D Beyond. But on its own, I think it's not a bad idea to start naming editions after the year they come out. And I'm guessing that they will abandon edition numbers going forward, while the community calls them colloquially something that's easier to say. What sucks, though, is the talking out of both sides of their mouth that we are likely to see. I will not be surprised if later this year they will be extolling all of the changes in the 2024 rulebooks and why you should buy the new books, which in the meantime will have just enough changes to obsolete what came before, and those books will no longer be on the shelves meanwhile, then you have to buy new versions of what you had before. I'm not going to be surprised if that's what happens. So I hope you enjoyed this tour as to why this is the 9th edition of D&D. If you enjoy my looking into the history of D&D, look at the playlist that will be at the end of this video, and I'll also link to it in the video description. So that's it. I've been Ronald the Rules Lawyer. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. Support my Patreon. You get ad-free early access and exclusive content. And also join my Discord where we talk Pathfinder 2nd Edition mainly, but also gaming in general. And we also have a drop-in, drop-out organized play system for Pathfinder 2e. So that's it. I've been Ronald the Rules Lawyer. I'll see you next time.